Good evening everybody. My name is John Fletcher, for those of you who don't know me. And like Ron and Brian and Derek and all the rest of us, we were brought up in Camperdown Terrace during the war years. We all have our individual memories, some of which will be the same, but each will have his own particular slant. So I'd like to give you just one or two of mine. Thank you. I don't know how well this is going to work out. We'll have a go. This is my brother Ken sitting in the middle of the family boat, the Hilda Mary, over on the Warren at the start of the war, and me sat in the stern, aged 5. And this is the back of Camperdown Terrace, and you may just make out behind the dinghy there a bungalow behind what was then number 36 Camperdown Terrace, now renumbered to 48, and that's the family boat in front of the bungalow in which my brother and I spent the war with my mother. My father was away at the time. The house next door on the right in the screen belonged to Percy Bradford, the chief pilot, and his sons Ivor Bradford and Bernard Bradford were our next door neighbours. If we look a little more closely at the bungalow now, you can see that in front of it, unlike the other garden, our wall is cut down a bit. And after Dunkirk, when we were threatened with invasion, one Saturday afternoon, a corporal and a couple of squaddies rolled up with a machine gun across their shoulders, some sandbags and a shovel, and promptly made a machine gun nest right in front of our lounge window, without so much as a by your leave. Fortunately, they moved it again a few weeks later when the threat of invasion wasn't reckoned to be quite so imminent. You'll note the rose arch just to the left of the bungalow in the picture, and I'll talk a little more about that as well. One evening when we were tying the boat up, my mother had been pruning the roses on that rose arch, and my brother and I and Roy Knight, who'd been out in our family boat, were just coming ashore, and a flight of aeroplanes came low over the chimney tops, and we thought naturally they were the fighter squadron from Exeter out coming back from an evening patrol. And I looked up and said, "Hang on, they've got black crosses on." I don't think we've ever run up that garden quite so quickly. Rose thorns strewn all over the place. We didn't feel a thing until we got into the house, and then suddenly realized that our feet were really quite painful. This is Belcher's Slipway just before the war, which was, of course, in those days was the sailing club's main access to the water. It wasn't long into the war, after Dunkirk, that the whole of the beach was surrounded by a barbed wire entanglement, with just a very small gap in front of Belcher's Slipway, which you had to crab sideways through as the tide was running, and hence it became known as Crab Hole. At least that's one of the many versions as to why it is called Crab Hole. The rest of the river was then filled up with spikes, as we called them, which was just random assemblies of scaffold poles all over the sandbanks to prevent gliders landing or landing craft from making too much progress up the river. And we also had a boom defence out the seafront. Other memories, boating over on the Warren. In those days there were 40-odd bungalows and tea rooms over there, but part of the Warren at the Dawlish end was used as a target for aircraft practicing before D-Day, so they would swoop down over the river, shooting at a couple of old army lorries put out as targets on Dawlish Warren, and we would go over there collecting the cartridge cases, 303s from the British machine guns, .5 caliber from the Americans, and quite a lot of 22 9mm cannon shell cases. Quite a lot of well worthwhile brass. Leading up to D-Day, the river became full of landing craft, and of course for a time we weren't allowed to use our boats. During the war we always had to immobilize our boats anyway, remove the bungs, bailers, oars, rowlocks, which in those days it was normal to keep in your boat on the beach. I still have copies of letters which my mother exchanged with the local naval officer in charge here, asking when we would be able to use our boats again shortly after D-Day. But it wasn't for another 6 weeks after D-Day that we were given permission to use our boats again. Obviously they needed to make sure that the landings were going to be a resounding success before they allowed free access to the river in case they needed it in a hurry to evacuate people. Eventually the war ended and celebrations took place. This was our VE Day celebration party in Point Terrace. Father Rice on the right hand side, and immediately in front of him is my mother, who helped organise it with all the other ladies there, and Joyce Butler in the dark jacket with her back to the wall, and I'm sure those of you who are talking tonight will recognise very many people in these photographs. Here we are again, another group picture of all the youngsters in the middle, Muriel Bradford this time on the left, to the left of Father Rice, and in this last group there is Ron Lavis's mother towards the left there, Brian and Derek's mother, Mrs. Rousel, in the middle,